A Little House on the Prairie. It's gone from series to spin-off to occasional special. But as our man in Hollywood, Jim Brown, reports this morning, tonight's special on NBC closes the book on one aspect of the show with a bang.
For 9 seasons, Little House on the Prairie was marketed to America as pure comfort television, a gentle window into pioneer life where every hardship ended in a hug and a lesson learned. Millions of families gathered around their televisions believing they were watching something simple and wholesome. What almost nobody realized at the time was that the show audiences fell in love with was never supposed to look that way at all, and that behind the cameras, the production was anything but gentle. It was a set defined by a bitter power struggle, a controlling star who ruled with an iron grip, a devastating affair that fractured the cast's trust, a pay dispute that dragged on for years, and a series finale so extreme that the man behind it literally blew up the town with real explosives. This is the story the studio never packaged for syndication. To understand how strange the show's origin really was, you have to go back to 1972, 2 years before it ever aired, when a television producer named Ed Friendly bought the rights to Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Friendly had built his career on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and his ambition for this new project was nothing like the show that eventually reached air. He wanted a raw, historically grounded depiction of frontier life, with children who genuinely looked poor, dressed in worn and dirty clothing, sometimes without shoes, living through the actual brutality of 19th century farm life rather than a softened version of it. To bring that vision to the screen, he hired Michael Landon to direct the pilot. Landon had just wrapped 14 years playing Little Joe on Bonanza, and NBC had given him a development deal that made him a valuable name to attach. Landon agreed to direct, but only if he could also star as Charles Ingalls, and Friendly accepted the condition without realizing how much power he was handing away. Almost immediately, the partnership fell apart. Friendly wanted grit and hardship. Landon wanted warmth, sentimentality, and mass appeal. He refused to let the child actors film barefoot in the punishing California heat where the series was shot, and he pushed back hard against the impoverished look Friendly had envisioned. According to Landon's own recollections in later interviews, he considered Friendly one of the very few people in his life he genuinely could not get along with. The dispute escalated until Landon delivered an ultimatum to NBC: either the network removed Friendly from active production, or Landon would walk away from the project entirely. Because Landon was already a bankable star under exclusive contract, the network chose him. Friendly was pushed out after the pilot, though his name remained in the credits for the entire run, and he reportedly walked away with roughly $40 million from the deal, a fact that apparently gnawed at Landon for years afterward despite having won the fight for creative control. That victory turned Little House on the Prairie into, in every meaningful sense, Michael Landon's show. He starred as the family patriarch, wrote nearly 50 episodes, directed close to 100 more, and served as executive producer, which meant there was almost no creative decision on set that did not run through him first. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary Ingalls, later wrote in her memoir that Landon was someone who had almost always already made up his mind, and that winning an argument with him was a rare event reserved for his very best days. She described him as brilliant and generous but also capable of turning cold and vindictive the moment his authority was questioned. That combination of talent and control became the defining feature of the entire production. To his credit, Landon used that control to push the show into territory that most family dramas of the era avoided entirely. Storylines confronted addiction, disability, racism, sexual assault, and death, often without the tidy resolutions audiences expected from primetime television. The show debuted on September 11, 1974, and climbed steadily into the top 20 of the Nielsen ratings, eventually running for 9 seasons until its final regular episode aired on March 21, 1983. But as the series entered its later years, the ratings began to slide, and at the same time, the man in charge of holding the whole production together was dealing with a personal collapse that everyone on set could see happening in real time. By the early 1980s, Landon had been married to his wife, Lynn No, for close to 20 years, and they had 5 children. The cast knew the family well. Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, had spent time in their home and had a personal relationship with Lynn. That familiarity made it especially jarring when an 18-year-old woman named Cindy Clerico joined the production as a stand-in for actress Melissa Francis. Clerico was more than 2 decades younger than Landon, and it did not take long for cast members to notice the change in his behavior. Karen Grassel later described in her memoir how Landon began openly discussing his rejuvenated energy on set, and the crew quickly understood that he had begun an affair. The relationship became an open secret, and according to multiple accounts, when Lynn eventually discovered the truth, the fallout was explosive, reportedly including a confrontation where she threw a bottle at him after following him and Clerico. Landon initially floated the idea of reconciling with Lynn and spoke publicly about renewing their vows, but the marriage did not survive. Their divorce was finalized in 1982, and Clerico, already pregnant, married Landon in a small ceremony at his Malibu home on Valentine's Day in 1983. That marriage lasted until his death in 1991. Their daughter, Jennifer Landon, later became a respected actress in her own right, known for her work on Yellowstone. The emotional damage to the cast, however, went far beyond gossip. Grassel, who already had a strained relationship with Landon over money, found the affair especially painful given how close she had been to the family being torn apart. Catherine McGregor, who played the sharp-tongued Harriet Olsen, reportedly found the entire situation distasteful. But the deepest wound belonged to Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls and had come to view Landon as something like a father figure after losing her own adoptive father. Gilbert was also close friends with Landon's daughter Leslie, which made the betrayal feel personal rather than distant. She has said in interviews that she carried that hurt for years, and that it was nearly a decade after the show ended before she and Landon fully reconciled. The affair was not the only long-running conflict simmering beneath the surface. Karen Grassel had her own separate battle with Landon that had nothing to do with his personal life and everything to do with pay. Grassel came into the role with serious theatrical training, including Shakespearean stage work, and once the show became a genuine hit and climbed into the top 10 of the ratings, she believed she had earned the standing to renegotiate her contract, which was common practice in the industry when a series outperformed expectations. Landon refused, telling her that the Caroline character was not popular enough to justify a raise and that her pay should be comparable to what the child actors were earning. Rather than continuing the conversation, he began quietly reducing her screen time and trimming her dialogue in multiple episodes, which Grassel later described as a deliberate response to her asking for fair compensation. She has said in more recent interviews that the ordeal left her running on resentment and exhaustion, and that she felt genuinely insulted as his co-star on a hit series, but she was reluctant to fight back openly because she understood how much power Landon held over the production. She eventually received a raise much later in the show's run, and despite everything, she has said publicly that she made peace with him before his death and holds appreciation for the opportunities the role gave her. Off camera, the two young actresses playing the Ingalls sisters were dealing with a rivalry of their own. Melissa Gilbert joined the show at 9 years old, while Melissa Sue Anderson, 2 years her senior, arrived already carrying herself with far more authority. Gilbert has said in interviews that from the very beginning, Anderson positioned herself as being in charge, both on camera and off, and she has described specific moments of physical friction between them during early filming. In her own memoir, Gilbert wrote candidly that she never developed a real sisterly bond with Anderson, describing her as distant and difficult to connect with, and suggested that Anderson seemed to live almost entirely within the world her mother had built around her rather than opening up to the rest of the young cast. Allison Arngrim, who played Nellie Olson and became close friends with Gilbert, has recounted that Gilbert warned her early on to be cautious around Anderson. Anderson herself addressed the tension years later in her own memoir, choosing not to attack Gilbert directly but acknowledging that the two of them were simply very different people, and in later interviews she reflected that she had been an unusually shy child who was always anxious about being seen as difficult. Remarkably, in December 2025, the two women publicly reunited in New York, with photos surfacing that suggested the decades-long distance between them had finally closed. Beyond the personal drama, the show itself pushed into subject matter that occasionally stunned its own audience. The clearest example is the two-part 7th-season story centered on a teenage character named Sylvia, a girl whose early physical maturity draws unwanted attention from boys in town, including Albert Ingalls. After being assaulted by a man in the community who is later revealed to be a trusted local blacksmith, Sylvia becomes pregnant and hides what happened to her, while her own father responds with shame and blame rather than support, and the town's gossip network turns against her rather than the man responsible. The storyline ends in tragedy, with Sylvia killed before she and Albert can escape together. For a series airing at 8 o'clock on a weeknight in 1981, the material was strikingly heavy, and it reportedly generated a wave of letters from viewers, some praising the show for tackling assault and victim blaming with unusual honesty for the era, others deeply unsettled that children were watching something so dark in a slot built around family viewing. The show's ending arrived under circumstances that were almost as dramatic as anything written into an episode. By its ninth season, ratings had fallen from the top 20 into the high 20s, and NBC ultimately decided to end the series, but instead of calling Landon to inform him directly, the network simply left the show off its fall schedule, meaning Landon learned it was over the same way the general public did. Melissa Gilbert has said that the disrespect of that decision, after a decade on Little House layered on top of his years on Bonanza, left Landon furious enough that he wanted to tear everything down. NBC eventually offered him 3 television movies to close out the story properly, and Landon personally wrote and directed the final one, titled Little House, The Last Farewell, which aired in February 1984. In it, the fictional town of Walnut Grove is claimed by a land developer, and rather than surrender their homes, the townspeople choose to destroy everything themselves, the school, the mill, the mercantile, all of it, before anyone else can take it from them. What makes that ending remarkable is that Landon did not fake the destruction. He used real dynamite to demolish the physical set. There was a practical justification behind it, since his agreement with the landowners required the property to be returned to its original condition, and detonating the buildings was faster and cheaper than dismantling them by hand. But Melissa Sue Anderson has recalled Landon telling her privately that part of his motivation was ensuring no other production could ever reuse those sets after he was finished with them. Only the church and the Ingalls family home were spared, and the Ingalls house was later saved from the property entirely by a Crew family who took it with them, though both that original structure and the replica built to replace it were eventually lost to separate fires years later. The cast was not present for the actual explosions for safety reasons and arrived the following morning to find their workplace already reduced to rubble, an experience Gilbert has described as producing a wave of grief that swept through the entire cast and crew once the reality of it set in. A persistent myth has grown around that finale over the decades, the idea that NBC found it too dark or violent and quietly banned it from ever airing again. That is not accurate. The finale did air on its original broadcast date and has been rerun since, but networks naturally favored lighter, earlier season episodes for syndication over a 2-hour finale centered on grief and destruction, and that absence from heavy rotation is likely what fueled the suppression rumor rather than any actual ban. It is also true that Landon's anger at NBC was real and well documented, but that anger existed alongside a genuine contractual obligation to clear the land, meaning the explosive finale was shaped by both motivations at once rather than pure spite alone. The show has never really disappeared. All 9 seasons and the 3 closing television movies remain available for streaming, and the series still airs in reruns across more than 100 countries decades after it ended. And the story is not entirely finished, because Netflix has produced a new adaptation drawn directly from Laura Ingalls Wilder's original books rather than Landon's version of Walnut Grove, notably executive produced by Trip Friendly, the son of Ed Friendly, the very producer Landon forced off the original show more than 50 years earlier. Several original cast members, including Gilbert and Arngrim, have spoken supportively about the new series, framing it as a fresh interpretation rather than a replacement. But whatever this new version becomes, it cannot recreate the physical world Landon built, because that world is gone. He made certain of it himself, one final act of control from a man who spent nearly a decade making sure nothing about that show happened without his approval, right up until the moment he decided nothing would be left of it at all.